All right, hello, folks, and welcome to week three of our post 1865 American Literature Survey. So now we're turning from last week. In our previous week, we read Toni Morrison's essay "Unspeakable Things Unspoken," which was, of course, a conceptual, theoretical foundation for the course as a whole. This week, we turn towards reading more literary texts, and that's what we're going to do for the rest of the semester. And so we did a little bit of thinking about the 19th century literary history with Whitman and Dickinson in week one, and how those two poets signaled a turn from thinking about American literature as a kind of inheritance of European literary forms, and how Whitman and Dickinson signal in American literary history a turn towards something distinctly distinctly American literary lineage through their poetics, right? Both what they wrote about and how they wrote. Right, we're always talking about content and form in this class, right? What does the language literally mean, but also how is it doing its work, right? Our double emphasis all semester that Toni Morrison talks about in her essay about asking us to do work. That work she's asking us to do is pay attention to language and remember that, quite simply, literature is art, right? So that's a quick, get you back up to speed to where we're at. This is week three. For week three, you have, I'm going to give you a little lecture. I'm going to give you a little lecture on realism and naturalism. This is another pivot point. So, an interesting thing about our course, because American literature surveys are always kind of split in two, as like two halves of a historical process. A lot of the beginning of this course is going to be me talking about turns or pivots or changes from a previous era to a newer era. Because across the Civil War, across the 19th century and into the 20th, we're going to talk a lot about things that are pivoting to other things, right? So realism and naturalism are this two-pronged pivot that happened in the late 19th century. So when I say they are a pivot or a turn, realism and naturalism, while they're slightly different, they share that they are a turn away from romanticism, sentimentalism, and melodrama. So as we talked about in class, romance was the dominant literary genre or mode of the first half of the 19th century. And by romance, we don't just mean stories where characters fall in love, which is what we think of when we think of romance. But more generally, romance refers to literature or art that is interested in a kind of elevated, fantastical version of reality. Not necessarily like literal fantasy, like magic, but thinking about like emotional exaggeration, thinking about plot lines that follow a kind of unrealistic, more kind of heroic journey. Um, you can think of kind of a lot of like earlier 19th century, or if any of you have taken classes on earlier British literature classes for earlier texts. But what you want to think about is romanticism is very much like crafting a kind of heroic, think of like Treasure Island, right? A heroic story where a protagonist gets to kind of brave the brave the obstacles and succeed at the end in a way that maybe isn't necessarily close to how life really works. Closely related to romanticism is sentimentalism, which was a key literary movement in both American and British literature, but it's especially important in 19th century American literature because of its utilization for multiple and sometimes contrary purposes. So, for example, well, to explain sentimentalism very briefly, is the idea of intentionally using heightened pathos. Pathos, if you've taken composition and you remember learning about rhetoric, you remember that pathos is an appeal to emotions. You should remember that from your comp classes. Sentimentalism is literature or art that explicitly um, utilizes pathos in order to guide an audience towards some kind of often political, but sometimes religious, sometimes just generally moral or ethical conclusion. So the classic, most important novel of the 19th century in the United States that would be this kind of example would be Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was an anti-slavery novel, a fictional novel that utilized sentimentalism, right? It created a novel where it created a story where it was intentionally trying to get readers to feel sorry for, to feel sympathy for, to be sentimental about the pain of its enslaved Black protagonists, right? It was using rather than making a kind of philosophical argument against slavery, it was emotionally trying to get mostly white, mostly northern, mostly women readers. Although it wound up being read by almost everybody, it was the most read book in America in the 19th century, other than the Bible. But it was trying to get readers to feel a certain way in order to become anti-slavery, right? And then melodrama is kind of, if we take romance sentimentalism and we take it from like novels and short stories and we go to the stage and we go to plays and theater, melodrama is um, dramatic literature, plays, musical theater, anything that would be on a stage that utilizes pathos, that utilizes kind of over the top, over exaggerated emotional storytelling. You can think of an actor on the stage just crying and really laying on thick all of their emotions, right? That would be melodrama. Really much like an exaggeration of reality, not necessarily like a look into the kind of nitty gritty of human psychology, right? So romance, sentimentalism, and melodrama. If you were English majors, we'd be more nuanced if this was like a 3,000 level English major class, but this is a 2,000 level survey. So that's kind of all you need to have in your head for these three terms that they refer to in different ways. Art that is explicitly appealing to emotions, that is exaggerated or otherwise kind of slightly removed from real life, whether in the case of romance, that kind of be like a heroic journey or an exceptional protagonist, or if it's a sentimentalism, to get the reader or the audience to like feel a certain way, or if it's a melodrama, it might be to feel a certain way, but it's also because in earlier theater, you wanted to make sure your emotion was readable to the very back of the theater, right? You have to sometimes like a quiet, reserved, subtle performance won't get caught by someone who's way in the back. So we also want to think about how these forms are influenced by other factors, right? So those three are like kind of the dominant mode of American literature in the 19th century up until the 1860s ish, right? Up until the Civil War. Um, uh, and what Another thing they all have in common is, to different degrees, they explicitly engage in moralizing. So it's very common for a sentimentalist novel or a melodramatic play to have a character literally announce like what message the audience is supposed to take away. So a character would literally say like, and we all ought to feel terrible for what goes on in the South under slavery, right? You say it, you explicitly say what moral should be taken away, right? And that's important because that is one of the biggest breaks away from romance that realism and naturalism do. They are one of the first objections that realist and naturalist writers have is that they are against moralizing. They don't want their texts to ask explicitly. They will do this a little bit, but way tunes down. Think of like taking a dial and tuning it way down, even if you don't turn it off. Explicit moralizing in their writing, right? And instead of doing this kind of over the top dramatic storytelling, what realists and naturalists want to do is they want to use sensory imagery, meaning appealing to the five senses to get readers and listeners and audiences immersed in the story, to feel like you're in a real place, right? As opposed to when you read something like Treasure Island, um, and you're like, wow, this is amazing. It's like an escape, right? Romance literature is an escape. You're escaping from reality, right? That's the term I should have used on the last slide, escapism, right? Romantic literature helps you escape from reality. Realist and naturalist literature says, no, we're going to give you all the sensory imagery to ground you in reality, right? That's a major difference. So rather than helping you escape, realism and naturalism want you to stay right here in the real world, but use fiction to think about the real world, right? So that's this kind of two-pronged break from romance sentimentality. Realists and naturalists, they don't want moralizing and they don't want escape. They want us to be grounded in the real world. And this is really influenced by the American Civil War and all of the death and gore that happened during that war. Um, it of course is a war that, in hindsight, we know ended the atrocious, absolutely immoral institution of chattel slavery. Um, but it was also a war in which uh, hundreds of thousands of um, Americans died. Um, and so the US culture in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for decades after, is really grappling with the aftermath of this war and what to do with death on such a huge scale. And one of the things that happens is writers start to say, in the face of all this death, um, we have to ground ourselves in the nitty gritty. We can't escape from this death. To which Morrison, if you remember it, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, I hope some of you remember that moment when Morrison says, "How did Why was it that romance and sentimentality were the dominant force when slavery was happening?" And so you can think about this, right? This is a real critique that Morrison is levying. That hopefully, if you didn't get it last week, you get it as you're listening to this lecture, right? Morrison was saying, why was it that while slavery was legal, while actual black people were being whipped and burned to death, while dogs were being sicked on children to rip their bodies apart, while sexual assault was a main, like, everyday occurrence under slavery, and all of this violence was happening, this literal rule by terror was happening to black people in the United States. How is it that in the face of all of that violence, all of that horror, the dominant mode of American literature was escape, romance, sentimentality? But then when the Civil War happens and a lot of white people die, then American literature says, oh no, we can't escape anymore. Now we have to deal with the nitty gritty reality. Right. And so that's Morrison's critique, which, if you didn't get it last week, now I'm hoping that this week's lecture helps you look back and make that connection and say, oh, that's what she was saying. Right. Um, so the American Civil War deeply influences this turn towards realism and naturalism. And realism and naturalism are essentially positing what I've shown on the slide as a theory of representation and authenticity. That they theorize, and when I say theorize, I mean that people like William Dean Howells not only wrote realist literature, but wrote essays and published essays that said this is what literature ought to do. And it was articulating a theory that the job of literature is to represent the real world and to be authentic to that real world, right? And so realism and naturalism are not only turns away from what was coming before, but they are also theorizations of something new, a theory of authenticity that literature must have. But there are differences between realism and naturalism. On the left, that person you see is William Dean Howells, who is a leading realist writer and critic. And on the right, you see French novelist Emile Zola, who is credited as one of the founding writers of naturalism as distinct from realism, right? Um, I personally, as a literary scholar, think that there's more overlap, and I personally think that they evolve um, a little bit more in tandem. But some literary historians will tell you it's more sequential, that realism comes first and then naturalism comes after. So I'm going to present it to you so that way you see how they're different. But I'm also going to present the case that sometimes these things overlap, even though they're different. Um, in realism, characters have agency. Characters drive the plot, right? In realist stories, like um, uh, like the War Prayer by Mark Twain, a character arrives, and even though it's satire, the arrival of that stranger who comes and gives that sermon, that character drives all of the action in that story. So realism is when a character is the one making decisions, making choices, and having the power to direct the narrative. In contrast, naturalism focuses on external forces of control. How are characters influenced by forces that are larger than them? How are characters, like, driven forward by natural disaster or political forces that are beyond their comprehension, or uh, I'll leave it with those two examples, or maybe like they're poor, and so that their poverty over determines, meaning over influences what they're able to do in their life, right? So in realism, there's real agency that characters drive plot. In naturalism, um, Naturalists are interested in how characters are driven by their environment, right? Um, so realism tends to elevate in that realism tends to elevate humanity into kind of this special case of being agential. Think of the story of Adam and Eve, of Adam naming the other animals and having that position of power that we talked about last week when we were looking at Ambrose Bierce's Chickamauga, right? Realism does like elevates human characters above their environments. Naturalism, in contrast, looks at human subjects as if they were subject to naturalist observation, as if they were another animal or another plant that a scientist was examining. So naturalists take humanity and level it with the rest of the natural world, whereas realists elevate humanity above the rest of the natural world, right? It's a very different way of thinking about humanity and therefore a very different way of writing human characters. um, Realism is focused on what we would call photographic accuracy. So a realist writer wants to like totally authentically represent the way the world appears, like on its surface. How does it look? How does it sound? How does it smell? How does it taste? How does it feel to our five senses? It really kind of has this external gauge on what does everything look like. Naturalists observe from the outside and then wants to dig into the depths of psychology. So naturalists, drawing on the influence of the development of the field of psychology and psychoanalysis, really start to think about like what if the natural environment influences humans, how then are humans' inner lives, what goes on in our head, influenced by that, right? Um, and so, whereas a realist's characters are going through life and kind of observing the world and interacting with the world, a naturalist's writer is going to do all of that, but then explore what's going on inside the head at the psychological level of their characters. And then the last bullet point is just some examples of people who are associated with both. So William Dean Howells, Mark Twain, and Henry James are famous realists. I mentioned Zola, and then Charles Darwin and Karl Marx are important to naturalism because Darwin and Marx both posit theories of how external forces influence individual people. So Darwin's theory of evolution is thought is developed in the 19th century, and writers and artists start to think about, oh, if we're products of evolution, how can the logic of evolution influence the way that we are as humans? And so that idea that like humans are here as products of a process that we didn't control, and therefore some evolutionary force has produced us, that means that we're not the supreme agents of everything, right? And so Darwin influences that way. Marx influences by theorizing that people are born into socioeconomic conditions that they cannot control. And so when we're examining characters in literature in different socioeconomic rungs of society, Marx influences naturalists by the way that naturalist writers create characters that are profoundly influenced by their external socioeconomic contexts, right? So Darwin and Marx are not naturalist writers, but their theories of evolution and Marxism directly influence naturalist writers. So that's why they're there. And then there are some overlapping aesthetics. So while realism and naturalism have important differences, in practice, many texts express attributes of both movements or styles. So two examples that we're reading in our class are Ambrose Bierce's Chickamauga, right? It has the sensory detail and historical fidelity of realism. It's about it's a fictional account of a real life Civil War battle, the Battle of Chickamauga, and it uses like dense sensory detail to put us in that moment and tries to be authentic to the horror of war. But in how figuratively grotesque it is, the way that it presents these injured soldiers um as like monster like, um and the way that these figures are kind of grotesque and almost gothic. There's a kind of naturalist aesthetic to it, which is even stronger when you consider the way that this young boy is influenced by external forces he cannot control or comprehend. And so in that way, Chickamauga mixes realism and naturalism. I would argue. You're welcome to argue back. And then Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, um, gives a very realist representation of gender depression and what happens to the protagonist, and how, as a woman, she is subject to the famous so-called rest cure that is developed in the 19th century, and really put under surveillance and control in a very patriarchal way, which I don't want to spoil too much or talk too much about because I want you to read the story and see what you think about it. But the representation in that story of gender depression is very realist. And in fact, like even though it's fiction, it's based on it's based on a real medical practice that was very gendered in its application that men used to male doctors prescribed for women who were quote unquote hysterical, right? And there's a whole history of how hysteria is really a sexist, patriarchal diagnosis of women who didn't want to do what men wanted, right? And so in that way, it's a very realistic story, and that was representing something that was happening to lots of women in like very stark terms. But in the stories focused on inner psychology and how much the narrator kind of questions their reality, and like there's this ghost-like figure in the walls, those kinds of elements where you're getting this ghost-like figure or this inner psychology examination, those are naturalist elements. I would argue that even more strongly than Chickamauga, the yellow wallpaper mixes realism and naturalism. And my question for you for your lecture response for this week is I want you to write 4 to 8 sentences, right? So more than one or two, so make it a real paragraph, about these two stories. Preferably both, but if you want to just pick one or the other. And I want you to talk a little bit about in your written response to this lecture, uh, how you see realism and naturalism in those stories, Chickamauga and the Yellow Wallpaper. And the last part of today's lecture is talking about, very briefly, Susan Glaspell's Trifles. I'm only going to say this, I'm not going to explain it because this is going to be next week, but it uses realism to gesture towards the aesthetics of what we're going to call modernism in future weeks in the class. So just keep the word modernism in your head. Trifles uses a lot of metaphor and dialogue, so pay attention and think about like, why are we talking about birds here? Really importantly, do not skip the stage directions. A lot of students, when they read plays, they think only the dialogue matters. The stage directions are so crucial. Do not skip stage directions. If you skip the stage directions, you will not understand the play. Don't skip the stage directions. And then finally, there's a very obvious feminist politics to the play, in that the play is very explicitly about the way that patriarchal society can imagine women's agency, even as patriarchal society seeks to control women. Um, but in addition to the kind of like content of the story that makes that clear, I want you to pay attention to the aesthetics and the form. So things like absence, the way that the play makes one of its most crucial characters absent from the stage. There is a character in this play that is crucial to the plot. The entire play is in some ways about her, but she never appears on stage. And that is a feminist aesthetic of absent presence, which, if you're again thinking week to week, you remember Morrison was also talking about absent presence. And so, this idea of absence and presence, I hope now in week 3 is on your radar as a student as an important thing to look for in the literary text in this class, right? There's so that idea of absence, of lack, of gaps, those are aesthetic choices, similar to how Emily Dickinson's pacing and dashes are aesthetic choices that have to do with a feminist politics, right? So it's always form and content. So those are just some things I want you to just think about really briefly when you're reading Trifles. There's some things I want you to have in mind about realism and naturalism. And hopefully this lecture is prompting you to start thinking about putting the first 3 weeks of our course together and start to make connections across. So previously, I asked you a question on the last slide about Bierce's Chickamauga and about Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper. And that was one question. This is the first lecture of the semester where I'm going to ask you a second question that I want you to respond to. And I'm going to end the lecture with this. I would like you to write anything totally open-ended where you demonstrate the connection between any 2 texts in the class from different weeks. So something from week 1 and week 3, from week 2 and week 3, from week 1 and week 2, any combination. But I want you to write anything, some kind of connection that you're drawing between two different weeks of the course. Does that make sense? Hope it does, because that's your second question for for this week's lecture response. All right. Well, I hope you have a good rest of the week, and I hope that this lecture clarifies a little bit about realism and naturalism for you.